Today in the show, we'll be talking about the recent movie Sound of Metal, starring Riz Ahmed. We'll also be discussing our thoughts on the movie, the reception of it by the deaf community, and the topic of cochlear implants. This is Doctor versus Comedian. I'm Dr. Asif Doja, and this is the Doctor of Laughs.
Not a real doctor.
Ali Hassan. Every episode, I pick a topic for Ali from comedy and entertainment, and I question him about it. Then Ali picks a topic for medicine and health and grills me on that topic. Today, we'll be discussing the movie Sound of Metal, directed by Darius Marder. We'll start with our thoughts on the movie, and later on, we'll talk about the issue of cochlear implants. Before we get to that, Ali, I want to talk to you about something I saw the other day on something you may have heard about, the internet.
Familiar.
It's actually on one of my favorite websites that I visit every day, the avclub.com. You probably know it's spin-off of The Onion, and they talk about pop culture, which we love talking about. So they had a really interesting question on there. They have what's called an AV Q&A, where readers will send in some ideas for questions they want to ask the staff writers, and the staff writers kind of give their opinion. So I thought we should do this Q&A with their question. So the question is, what two pieces of unrelated pop culture are forever connected in your mind? So I want you to think about that, and I'm going to give you my example so it can kind of help you. And if our listeners want to send us their examples of two pieces of unrelated pop culture that are linked in their mind, that would be great. Send it to us at drvcomedian@gmail.com or connect with us on Twitter or Instagram. Okay, so my example for you is it actually occurred when I was on paternity leave with my first daughter. I took 3 months off and my wife went back to work. So I was taking care of my daughter every day. And those of you who've taken care of children know she was about 8 or 9 months at the time. It's tough, and again, my total sympathy to parents who stay at home, both men and women. It's definitely a lot of work. And you realize this when you're the sole caregiver and your partner's at work. So when you have a little baby, you have a couple options of things to do during the day. You can either when they're having a nap, you can have a nap, you can exercise, you can eat something, you can watch TV or something like that. But you can't do all those things. You have to pick. And then you'll just, if you don't get the shower today, do it tomorrow. That's okay.
I like the combination of they sit in front of the TV and you nap while they're engrossed by something.
Oh, that's your strategy?
Well, I've never been accused of being a wonderful parent, but I know that there's a few times we try to keep them off the devices, but there's sometimes where just for your own sanity, come on.
Yeah, you have to do that. So what I would do when I would have a break is I would do two things when my daughter was having a nap, just for my own sake. And one of them was to listen to an album, which I had just downloaded, which is the 59 Sound by the Gaslight Anthem, which is one of my favorite bands currently. It's, I think, the best American band that's out there right now. They're on a bit of a hiatus right now, but I love that band. That album is amazing. And I was getting back into thinking about old video games that I played as a kid. So I bought a CD-ROM back when people would play video games on CD-ROMs, and I played Dragon's Lair. Do you remember Dragon's Lair, Ali, when we were growing up?
I don't. And I'm happy to say I don't. I lived a full life as a young person.
Dude, I can't believe you don't remember this. Dragon's Lair was an arcade game, but it was like a cartoon. You played a knight and you would move the joystick and it would move to a different scene in the cartoon. So it was like you were playing a live action cartoon.
That does ring a bell.
Yeah, I'm sure you've seen it. And so I bought that and I played that. So the two things that are linked to me are the Gaslight Anthem's 59 Sound and the video game Dragon's Lair. So what about you?
Well, okay, and just to be clear, were you doing both those things while your child was eating poison in the corner of the kitchen somewhere, or was this during nap time?
She was too young to crawl, so don't worry about that, but it was during nap time.
Well, this is the one thing that comes to mind, and I think we probably all have a dozen of these things if we think about them, but this is something that comes to mind for sure for me. When I was a kid, my Saturdays were WWF wrestling. The F was there, present at the time, followed immediately by like 2 hours of PBS cooking shows. So in my life, wrestling and cooking shows somehow have become a pair. And also the third thing was my mother's yelling from upstairs. I had a mother who didn't enjoy it when I was having a good time, still doesn't. So there was a lot, come up and eat, you've wasted half your day. That somehow I've been able to take out of my mind. But I used to, still when I watch wrestling, I think about, Jacques Pepin or Ming Tsai's East meets West or what, there's always all these, Julia Child. And so we went to a wrestling event, you and I don't know if you remember how much food I continuously bought. I think do you remember that? I was like,
yeah, it's true. It's true.
It was an obscene amount of, like, I must have set a record internally. Like, people get a couple of drinks and popcorn, but I was also looking for, like, nachos, hot dogs, anything sort of.
I think you set a record
gourmet.
at the Air Canada Centre in Toronto, actually.
What do you mean? That's a record.
They never sold that much food to one person before.
I know, exactly. And I went back 3 times. So anyway, and I think that's because I associate wrestling with food. I don't know. I'd be happy to sit in a chair and have a psychotherapist break that down, or I could just live the rest of my life in peace, loving wrestling and food. And scene.
Okay, Ali, so let's move on to our topic that we're going to talk about today, which is the movie Sound of Metal, directed by Darius Marder, starring Riz Ahmed. And I guess I want to talk to you a bit about what you think about the movie and your overall thoughts. And yeah, maybe we'll start off with a bit of background for people who haven't seen the movie.
Sure. And we should tell people that there's going to be a spoiler in this. If you haven't seen The Sound of Metal, you can put this on pause and give this movie your time. I think it really deserves it. I think it's well done and well acted. So I'll start by saying these 2 things. Number one, my sister wears hearing aids. She has, since she was a child, warned them she's hearing impaired. She's part of the deaf community. She doesn't know sign language, which is a huge part of this film. But I do have sort of this peripheral interest in hearing impairment as a thing. I don't think many other people spent parts of their youth going to visit the, in my case, it was the Montreal Oral School for the Deaf. I don't think that's a common thing, but that is part of my life and remembering her diagnosis and what that has meant for her over her life and knowing kind of the peace and the tranquility she gets by taking her hearing aids off and just shutting out the world. That's something that many people won't know. And this movie sort of dives into that a little bit too. So I have that level of interest in this film. But besides that, I also have an enormous level of respect and admiration for Riz Ahmed. Now, Riz Ahmed is Muslim and he is Pakistani. So I know the sort of barriers that are up against somebody from that background being a lead or a supporting lead in a movie. So I have a lot of respect for who he is and what he's become as an actor. And not only that, but the level of preparation this guy does. Many different ding-dongs can be actors, Asif. I don't need to tell you that. But I'm talking...
I'm just looking at you right now. So
I know, and where else would you look? This guy spent 7 months learning ASL. ASL, by the way, American Sign Language, sort of the standard here for sign language. He spent 6 months learning how to drum so he could be the drummer, so he could become this character. And many people... even some in the deaf community, I've read all these reviews, they are reluctant to give him his due because they wish it was played, the lead role was played by a deaf actor, and yet they still give him his due because in a way he came in as an outsider as Riz Ahmed, but also the character in this film is very much an outsider who, I guess in his late 20s or 30s, whatever age he is, this character Ruben, all of a sudden finds himself faced with this intense and almost complete hearing loss. So he does a phenomenal job, and it really was an amazing movie. And Asif, you had talked, when we were talking about the Oscars, you had talked about the fact that they were nominated for sound, and we don't often talk about that. These are sometimes the forgotten categories, but you will notice that when you see this movie, and if you have already, it messes with you, right? It's an auditory experience to go through what he was going through. And it is very much part of this movie. So I'm a big fan of this film, not just because it's Riz and because of my own connection with my sister, but I thought it was an actor who did an incredible job with a very good script, and this director as well, Darius. I like a lot of his other work, or the two films that I've seen before of his. I'm a fan, so I liked it. And you could talk a little bit about this plot a little bit more deeply and what you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I liked it a lot as well. I guess in the movie, as you said, he plays this drummer. It's called Sound of Metal. They're not really a metal band. I think they're more of a hardcore punk / metal band. And it's him and his girlfriend, played by Olivia Cook. And as you said, he experiences very rapid, sudden hearing loss at the movie. And again, apologies for spoilers. I think most people know that's what happens in this movie. And then they're looking around for what to do, and he encounters, and they basically get referred to this deaf community where they teach people who are also recovering addicts, and they kind of integrate people into this deaf community, and they feel, the leader of the community feels that he could benefit Riz Ahmed's character. And so it's that kind of coming in as an outsider for that movie. And you're right, a lot of deaf writers, the one I'm thinking of is Sarah Novick, who's a great writer. I think we'll talk about some of her perspectives a bit more. And so she was commenting on the movie and saying, would we like to see a deaf actor in the movie? Yes, but this movie isn't really about a deaf person. It's about a hearing person who becomes hearing impaired and deaf. And that's very different. And because when we're talking about deaf people, often the deaf community often uses a capital D, right? A capital D meaning the community of deaf people. And so she's like, this is the journey of somebody going forward and seeing how they can integrate themselves. And a lot of it is, what I loved about this movie is, and Riz Ahmed has talked about this on several interviews, is it talks about who you are and what we are as people, right? And for the character of Ruben in the movie, he was a boyfriend, a recovering addict, and a metal or hardcore drummer. That was his...
Yeah. That's right. And the boyfriend part it is an important part of his identity, because as a recovering heroin addict, he has found somebody else who also, I don't know if it was mentioned, but she also suffers, she's in recovery from something. And so he's sort of committed to her in a very beautiful way. I mean, you see him making those smoothies for her in the morning and getting her up and being a supportive person. And when it's time for him to go into that treatment alone, away from her, you see he's basically having another thing almost at the same level as his hearing being ripped away from him with respect to her absence. So the boyfriend is it's not just your average run-of-the-mill boyfriend. It is a recovering addict who finds his path to recovery in her and in his devotion to her. And it's a big part of it.
Yeah, Riz Ahmed was interviewed by a couple places, NPR and Fresh Air Experience. He was interviewed by the AV Club, which we talked about before. And in it, he compares what's going on with his character to what's going on with people in the pandemic. And at first you're like, well, what are you talking about? Nobody's experienced hearing loss because of the pandemic. But his point is, I'm a guy who I go to the gym and I go to the bar on the weekend with my friends, or I'm a teacher, but now it's online school, and how all those things affect you because you're not the same person you were a year ago. I read an article which I thought was really frivolous. It was about, you can't travel. You're a traveler. You travel the world and you can't travel now. How do you cope with this? And I'm like, come on. Yeah, exactly. Oh, talk about first world problems. But there are a lot of people who define themselves like, yes, I save up all my money. I go backpacking. I volunteer in other countries. I do all this stuff. And what happens when that's taken away? That's why a lot of people are having this depression and frustration and angst during the pandemic, is because who am I? And how can I be what I am when these things have been taken away from me? And that's why this movie, I think, resonates with so many people at this particular time, because the average person is not going through hearing loss, but they're going through, I thought I knew who I was, and that's all been taken away. Right. What is the way forward? And that's, in fact, the journey that Ruben goes on in this movie.
Right. And I want to make a final point about ASL, which I thought was very interesting, because you mentioned that interview with NPR. And shout out to Terry Gross, the host of Fresh Air on NPR. I listened to that. I grew up in Montreal, and we got Vermont Public Radio from across the border. So I just always happened to be in the car between 4 and 6. And I would often catch Terry Gross. So when she passes, a part of me will die as well. This woman has helped raise me. But anyway, her interview with Riz, I encourage everyone to, because it's not just about the movie, it's more about Riz's experience in the film industry and a number of different things. Very, very fascinating. And he's very eloquent and well-spoken. But one thing I loved, he was talking about ASL. And I think this is something people who are not familiar with sign language should connect to and try to take away from this film, that when you communicate with ASL, he said, you're communicating with your entire body, and you're very much inhabiting what you're communicating, and you're not hiding behind words. This is a trope that the deaf community has for the hearing community, that they hide behind their words. And I thought that was so interesting. And I think it speaks to my love for stand-up comedy and for performance in general, especially those performances where you use both words to their fullest and you use your body to its fullest. And of course, not everybody does that in stand-up comedy. You have Stephen Wright and Mitch Hedberg are these kings of comedy, stand-up comedy, who just sort of stood at a mic and didn't move for an hour of their show. But in that itself, in that rigidity of their body, they know what they're doing. They know exactly what they're doing. So even a head cock to the side or a complete silence and abrupt stop after they say something, even that is really a use of your body in a way. So I thought that was very, very interesting. And, when you come from a community that is very people who talk with their hands, many Southern European communities, my buddies who are Italian and Pakistanis, Punjabis, there's a lot of talking with their hands. I really love that idea of inhabiting the way you communicate and inhabiting your communication.
Well, that's really interesting you say that, because it makes me think, you talk about the body and how we use that for communication, but the flip side almost happens in this movie at the beginning, right? And there are some great interviews with Nicholas Becker, who's the sound designer. Again, I cannot speak more, as you mentioned, about the sound design in this movie. It is so good. So what they did was Nicholas Becker, along with the director and the film editor, they went into like sensory deprivation tanks where you cannot hear anything. And then, so when you go in one of these tanks, apparently I've never been in one, but you first hear nothing. And then you hear your body. You can hear your heart beating. You can hear the tendons move in your body, because you're not used to this level of silence. And that's what they wanted to get from Riz Ahmed's character. So when he first loses his hearing in the movie, the sound drops out, and then they put in these sounds. They put a mic up to his heartbeat. To his heart. They put a mic to super sensitive mics to get his tendons moving when he's trying to continue with the drumming, but he doesn't hear that. He only hears the sounds of his own body. And just for them to think about that and to just try and be so in the moment with that is really amazing. And it's the opposite, right? It's internalizing everything as opposed to the externalizing that you were talking about.
Sure. And I will add to that, if you're going to watch this on a laptop, if you're going to watch this on some personal device, this is a headphone movie. Do yourself that favor and have that intimate listening experience on your headphones. So we've talked at length about our love for this movie. Now I'm going to talk to you, Asif, about some things that I bumped up against here, and you tell me if I should have bumped up against them or not. I'll get to these two things in time. Let me start with the first one. And as you sort of talk about a little bit more about the movie, we'll talk about it. What we are going to talk about is the medical element of this film, which is the cochlear implants. But before we get to the implants, Asif, you spoke about this. He experiences rapid, sudden hearing loss. Is that a thing? Is that a real thing? Because my feeling is with hearing loss, I've only seen it as gradual, with the exception of people like my sister who were born with hearing impairment. So that rapid sudden loss, is that a real phenomenon? Does that exist in the world?
It is, and there's different sort of causes. Sometimes you can get a very acute or rapid hearing loss with something called Meniere's disease. That's usually associated with what we call tinnitus. Some people call it tinnitus, but those are people who I disrespect. I call it tinnitus, and some vertigo as well. And you can have recurrent episodes of that. And sometimes that hearing loss can be permanent when you have those episodes. And we used to think that hearing loss was more gradual, but there definitely is a lot of evidence for patients who have this very rapid hearing loss. And they don't address this in the movie. We assume that when he sees the doctor and sees the audiologist and things like that, that this would have been looked into. But there's a very rapid hearing loss that can occur, which is kind of an autoimmune phenomenon. So the body kind of attacking itself. And the thought is, if you treat those patients rapidly with an anti-inflammatory medication like a corticosteroid, so not steroids for your bodybuilding that you've been doing, Ali, but I mean not anabolic steroids, but corticosteroids, then that can help. So anybody ever has rapid onset hearing loss, you need to see a doctor immediately, because if you don't treat it immediately, then it could be lasting. You need to treat it within a few days of the onset. So it can occur, and I'm just going to assume in the movie that was looked into and that wasn't the cause.
Sure. There is some reference to autoimmune disease. The doctor does say that at one point. Also, in my defense, I do use the other steroids because my eczema sometimes requires corticosteroids. More information than anybody needs. Anyway, I'm glad you did mention that, because in my mind, because he's a drummer, it would be slow, right? So I bumped up against that idea. I'm like, a drummer, wouldn't it be over time and metal and loud music, and slowly your hearing would go? But it's good to know that that's based in reality, and I'm sure it is. Otherwise, a lot of people would have jumped on it right away. Now let's talk about these cochlear implants. I'd never heard of them before. I didn't know they were an option. They are very controversial, and I think that's something you can talk about. But my biggest thing that I bumped up against was Riz Ahmed's character gets these cochlear implants and then finds out how they work. Is that even possible? Or would you have this entire... Because the suggestion is he's just an impatient person. He is like, let's get this fixed, and I got to get back on the road. I got to play my music. I don't care. Yeah. Do it. How much is it? Yeah, fine. Do it. He is that person as a character. But is that realistic? Is that possible that could happen without him knowing what the real world of cochlear implants would mean for him?
Right. So a couple of things with that. To answer that question specifically, I find it very hard to believe that people would put these in without telling him about all the different steps involved and what's involved. And we'll get into that in a second, but it kind of brings up something that actually does happen in medicine. I'll see a patient, my appointments are very long for a new patient, 45 minutes, sometimes an hour, that I spend talking to the family, explain everything. And then you hear the next day they're talking to one of their friends or they're talking to another doctor, and they're like, yeah, they didn't tell me anything. I spent 45 minutes with you. We definitely talked about this. I have it clearly documented. We talked about this. So sometimes people don't hear even when they're listening. Very interesting turn of phrase I'm using for this podcast.
Right. Well, I've been through this where somebody says, like at a comedy show, like, oh yeah, I'd heard most of the comedy before. And I'm like, I literally did 2 jokes that were old, and the rest was all brand new material over 40 minutes. Hey, we're not so different, you and I. Hey, Asif, I also do like 45 minutes. So you talk about actual life-changing things, but, I got glorified fart jokes. Anyway, the point is, I go through that too. I think it's a human phenomenon where people want to seem like they know more than they do or something.
But again, that's an aside, and that wasn't portrayed in the movie. So, let's go to your question about these cochlear implants. So let's back up and just talk about what they are. So these are these sound processors that essentially they fit behind your ear, and the processor will capture signals and send them to a receiver, which is implanted under your skin behind the ear. So we saw that in the movie, and this will send electrodes that are implanted in the inner ear, which is the cochlea, and which is the area that will normally is where we receive sound, and the sound gets transmitted essentially into your brain. So it bypasses a defective cochlea. So first of all, it doesn't replace certain kinds of problems. There's something called conductive hearing loss, which is not a nerve-related hearing loss. It won't help that. It won't help if the nerves that come from your ear that go into your brain, or if there's a problem in your brain that is a problem with the processing of auditory information. So it has to be for what we call sensory neural hearing loss. And the issue with a cochlear implant is it doesn't come preloaded like your new laptop. It doesn't come preloaded with language information. The user has to spend a lot of time in speech language, auditory verbal training to understand the sound and how
Is
speech
it like a
works.
year? Like we're talking about
years, not a year.
Okay.
And no, it's different. Ruben is a unique case because he could hear and then he's lost his hearing. So it may be a modified training program. But if we're talking about children who have never heard, who are now hearing, or who were very young when they lost their hearing. So a lot of people are born with this type of hearing loss. It's often genetic, not always, and other times they can get it acquired. The most probably the most common reason for acquired hearing loss is meningitis. It could often affect the ears. So worldwide, that's probably the most common. So this goes to your point, though, before. Hearing impairment is not a surgical problem. It's not like your appendix is inflamed. Take out the appendix, you're fine, right? There's a surgical approach that a cochlear implant surgeon can do. But really, you need to prepare people beforehand, because they've seen studies on patient and parent satisfaction after the surgery is clearly related to their expectations of what it's going to do. And everyone needs counseling before and afterwards, because it's this life-changing thing. So that was not really explained, I would say, terribly well in the movie.
Right. And so I sort of went on, as a person who didn't know about cochlear implants and who was watching this movie for the first time, I kind of went on Ruben's journey with Ruben. I was like, oh, he's getting his hearing back. And in fact, that's not exactly, it's not accurate to say that.
Exactly. And so, well, a couple of things. First of all, the other issue with this movie is they talk about it not being funded, right? He had to come up with the money on his own. And, you know, in Canada, it would be funded completely. In the US, from my understanding, from reading a lot of news articles and blog posts, it would be covered. It would be very unusual for someone to not have this covered due to the Affordable Health Care Act and Medicare and Medicaid. So that was my understanding. Another reason why the sound designers are amazing in this movie is because apparently when they turn on his cochlear implants, that is exactly what people hear when they turn on the cochlear implants. And you'll see when you see this movie, if you haven't seen it yet, hopefully you have, because we've just spoiled the ending for you. But it's this feedback, static. It is, and you can just see the excruciatingness of hearing. And that's apparently people who've had cochlear implants say, yes, that is exactly what it sounds like. And how the sound designer on this movie, who is not deaf, who has not had cochlear implants, was able to capture that is amazing, because you're capturing what somebody hears inside their head. You know, it's amazing. So there's lots of videos online about babies' faces lighting up when they're hearing sound for the first time, when they've had cochlear implants. And there's some adults who cry, you know, you can just Google this and you'll find a bunch of things on YouTube. So,
but that is where the controversy lies, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there's some really good articles about this issue of, do you need to do that? Do you need to treat people who are hearing impaired and deaf? And are cochlear implants the answer? There's a good article which we'll link to from the Insider, which basically goes through a couple of like real people who didn't understand that the surgery is not a cure, again, like we talked about, and all this time and that needs to be spent afterwards is only one piece of the puzzle. And people talk about how their expectations were incorrect, and the process is very physically and mentally taxing. It takes a lot of practice to use. And some people, either as adults who got them, said, forget it, I'm not doing it. Or there are some children who had it. And there's one story in this Insider article of a person who basically just said, you know, when they turned 18, they're like, forget it, I'm not doing this anymore. I'd rather just do sign language and be part of the deaf community. And this is the bigger issue, I think. There's this concept of autism. Okay, I don't know if you've heard of this. This is like, it's like sexism, you know, discriminating people because of their gender, discriminating people because of hearing impairment. And the hearing people assume that all deaf people would naturally want to take advantage of a method that could have them become part of the hearing world. And there's a really good article in The Atlantic from several years ago by Allegra Ringo,
Okay.
and where she talks about this. So basically, you know, cochlear implants are such an advanced technology, but not all deaf people want to hear. American Sign Language is a cultural cornerstone for these people. And there's a disagreement, I guess, between hearing people and non-hearing people. One group sees deafness as a disability and the other sees it as a culture. But the issue, which a lot of people will say, is one group holds a lot of power in this world, which is obviously the hearing world, hearing people. And so that's why is deafness something that needs to be fixed? And there's a lot of really interesting things. I mentioned Sarah Novick before. She has written a couple articles, again, which I'll link to, one from the New York Times, and then another one that came out after Sound of Metal, where she talks about this. And there's a lot of discussion as well. Should children with cochlear implants learn sign language as well at the same time? So they have multiple methods of communication, or should they not? What does the scientific literature show? So there's lots of discussion about that. But you can think about it, the deaf community and sign language, that is part of their identity. And there is a real worry that that may be taken away. And it's different. If it's hearing parents who have a hearing impaired child, that's one thing. But what about deaf parents who may have a deaf child? Because maybe it's genetic or something like that. And the decision-making process may be different for these different people.
Well, I found this entire thing very interesting because, growing up with my sister being hearing impaired, and just that's the interesting part. I was trained not to say deaf. It was hearing impairment, right? That was the thing. And to hear, now it's deaf community and there's pride in the community. And it's like there's something we're able to do and feel and experience that other people can't experience. That pride was something, I don't know, was very exciting for me to see. I really enjoyed seeing that. And you mentioned Sarah Novich, and I also wanted to talk about those micro,
she's talking about microaggressions. Yeah, talk about those. They're very
because Asif and I, if I can speak for you for a sec, we go through that sometimes where somebody goes, "Oh, you're from India, you're from Pakistan. I love samosas." It's like, you know what? Don't reduce me to a samosa. Or worse, like, "Oh, I really like hummus," which is like ignorance on top of a microaggression. So I just want to mention these because these are, we well-meaning people do stuff like this. So Sarah Novich is hearing impaired herself, and she says she calls it the triad of microaggression. So one is this incredulity at deaf independence, where people would be like, "Oh, you can drive," that kind of thing. So some people are just saying that of a place of conversation, but I think it's worthwhile for people to understand that you're immediately treating it like a debilitating handicap when you say things like that. The other one is a comparison to an animal. "Oh, my cousin has a deaf dog," which is the, "Oh, I love hummus" sort of equivalent. Like that, it's so you're bringing up a different species and you're reducing me to something that I'm not, and you're not connecting with me when you do that. And then the final one is something that I can picture many people doing. I can picture myself doing something like this, and it's not intentional, and yet you got to consider the way this comes across, which is the intimation that death is preferable to deafness, where people say things like, "Oh my God, you're deaf. I would just die without music." Understand for a second how that would sound to somebody who is unable to hear music. What does that do for them? It does nothing. It's just you hearing the sound of your own voice, basically. So I really thought that those were worth mentioning. And also about, this pride that the deaf community takes in this sort of superpower that I think they feel that they have. And you see it in this movie in such a beautiful way. Please forward 15 seconds what I'm going to say if you have not seen the movie. At the end of the movie, when Riz Ahmed, after going through hell to get these implants, being sort of excommunicated from the deaf community, struggling with he takes them out, and he finally sees what Paul Raci was talking about, the actor Paul Raci, which was this joy and this peace and the tranquility in the kingdom. That, what does he call it? Like the salvation, he calls it, that the kingdom of God, right? That moment where you can experience absolute silence. And he experiences it for himself. And I think that's a great moment for viewers to be like, "Oh, God, that would kind of be incredible from time to time," especially some of us who live in these urban, noise polluted centers. You're running off to the cottage just to get some peace and quiet. I know some people.
I think it's also more Ruben understanding at the end that there is more than just this hearing world.
Absolutely.
You know?
I mean, that's what it is about. That is at its core what it's about. I'm just saying, as a viewer, it's a moment to understand and appreciate that.
Right. And maybe to look at things from a different point of view. Now, one thing that Sarah Novick, and I keep saying Novick, but it's probably Novich. I apologize to her for that. She emphasizes in one of her articles, I think in the New York Times, where she was saying that most deaf people actually use multiple methods of communication and technological support. They don't just use sign language. They don't just use cochlear implants. They don't just use hearing aids. They probably use a combination. And so for her opinion...
lip reading as
lip reading, yes, exactly. Yeah. And so for her, she thought that the ending of the movie, which is not the very end, but kind of the denouement, where he is, again, it's a spoiler, but Ruben is basically kicked out of the community he was in because he chose to get cochlear implants. Sarah's point is, it's not a this or that. Right? There are certainly people who can be part of the deaf community who have cochlear implants. And I think she thought that rang relatively false, and you don't want to have the deaf community exclude children, for example, who have cochlear implants. You want to be inclusive. And I guess her final take on the movie is, as we said before, it's not a movie about people who are deaf. It's about a person who is hearing, who is trying to find his place between these two worlds. And her point is, it's not made for her because that's not her lived experience. But there are people in Ruben's situation who've been there, and that's who the movie's for. But again, we've talked about how a lot of these themes really resonate with us in our daily lives. Well, that's our show for today. Before we go, Ali, anything to plug?
Yeah, I'm going to plug our listeners. We're getting some. There's a few thousand of you out there, and we really appreciate you engaging with us and listening to us and giving us those 5-star ratings. Those really help us sort of climb these various charts. So if you have a suggestion for a show that you'd like to hear, a theme you'd like to hear, something in the medical community that you don't fully understand, or something that you really do understand that you wish other people did, or similarly in comedy and entertainment, reach out. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and email. It's all Dr. V Comedian. The email is gmail.com. Or you can reach out. You can check out our website, drversuscomedian.com. I know that's weird. The V and the verses, that is because of a text limit on Twitter and Instagram. So don't think we're lunatics. We're not trying to make your life hard. That's just the way it had to be. Not
trying to be confusing on purpose. And just before we finish off, please remember that although I'm a doctor, Ali isn't. I'm not your doctor. Medical issues we talk about are for your interest and information only. They're not medical advice. Please consult your medical professionals for actual medical advice. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
See ya.